All right. So this house believes that doctors should not be obligated to report suspected case of domestic abuse. This is a principal debate essentially, and I'll move into the crux of my analysis. Before I do that, I'll have some definitions for the house. I'll move on with starting domestic violence first, which is when an individual in a cohabitating position or in a domestic setup decides to apply physical force against the other cohabitating partner. It can be husband and wife, a dad and daughter, or anything in the domestic setup, of course. The second essential definition in this case would be of the doctors. I'll recognize these individuals as professionals who are expert in their fields of understanding mental health issues, surgery, or anything that relates to their field particularly. Third is the essential assumption that suspected case of domestic violence. Now, the core crux problem that the government side has today is the idea that the only problem with domestic violence is the individual not accepting it as a crime. So people who are inflicted with domestic violence, they don't think that it's a crime essentially. So that we believe is the problem. The silence of the victim is the basic problem. And when that comes from the doctors, we believe doctors are not the appropriate authority this crime should be reported as. And even if you end up catching some of the victims through this process, we believe you're not essentially solving the problem of domestic violence, because domestic violence is going to exist even if doctors continuously report it at the end of the day. So your problem is the mentality to make people accept the fact and make them aware of the fact that that this is essentially wrong and they should not be convicted of them. And thirdly, patients do not have their consents when doctors when doctors will report. So this is my first analysis, and before I move on to the idea that what will happen once doctors start to report this crime, I'll pass on the mic. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for the debate and for clarifying the definitions. I'm going to base my rebuttal to your premise on the idea of willful negligence. And just to be clear, when I mean willful negligence, I mean the type of negligence that is deliberate with the intentional disregard for the other people's welfare. We understand that doctors, maybe more so than most, if not all, of the professions aside from police or some other intimate protective service, have the opportunity to recognize situations where individuals may come to harm, may harm themselves, or may put themselves into situations where they will be harmed. It is not unusual for doctors to recognize the signs and symptoms of an illness or a potential harm to their patients and then to act on it. What is unusual and what is, I would say, unlawful or at least unethical is for a doctor to recognize the signs and symptoms of a potential illness or a potential harm to their patient and then not act to treat that. In doing so, they break what I would consider the understanding and the relationship between the patient and the doctor. The doctor should at least bring up with the patient that they suspect this is going on, and if the patient then responds that they don't want to move forward with it, the doctor is still then obligated to alert the proper authorities. We see this example when patients are mentally mentally out of sorts, when they're having some sort of psychiatric break, when they're a danger to themselves, when they're in danger to other people. Doctors will go against the patient's will and use their medical judgment in order to make sure that they don't come to harm and they don't put themselves in situations where they can be harmed. If a doctor whose patient is having a psychotic break simply ignores it and their patient comes to harm, they will be held accountable before being willfully negligent. If their patient comes to harm through domestic violence when they were aware that it was happening and they were also willfully negligent in reporting it, the doctor is going to be held responsible. And since the doctor will be held responsible, then they are obligated to report those cases. That's going to be the crux of my argument, is going to center around the idea of willful negligence. I'm going to pass the mic back to you for your next turn. I don't know how it got back to me. Okay.
All right. So the first problem that wasn't recognized is that at the end of the day, we're trying to control this whole problem with domestic violence. Since the 90s, and we've come so far in the first 21st century, it's the idea that people do not think that it's a crime, first of all. And even if the idea that doctors are responsible in this case, we believe we're not solving the whole problem of domestic violence in itself. Why is that not happening? Because even if you end up catching one or two cases when doctors, and by the way, these doctors are reporting reporting this whole observation as a crime. We believe that is the problem. This needs to come from the patients themselves. Why? Because they're the main victims of this crime. And why is it important to come from them? Because in this setup, it's essential that we know that they've been harmed. It's essential that in every household, it is recognized that this kind of behavior is not acceptable into the society. And when this comes from doctors, we believe we're going to end up harming those kind of industries as well. Because patients will be reluctant to go towards doctors because if they think their privacy is being breached, first. Second, that doctors have particular industries like helping mental health patients would be much more harder when their households is reluctant to send their when a husband that causes the pain is reluctant to send his wife towards a doctor that can essentially report that crime. We believe you're harming a whole industry by breaching this doctor patient privilege. First, the second idea that the second sorry yeah, so the second idea is that your main aim at the end of this debate is to show to me that how, in your case, you're solving the problem of domestic violence in its eternity. We believe that in your case, doctors are merely guessing. Doctors are definitely professionals that can catch an illness or whatever their expertise is, but they cannot just guess and suspect a case that this individual is going through something, and on his behalf, even though I don't have his consent, I'm going to report this crime to authorities that might be able to help him. But even if you end up doing that, we believe you're not solving the problem. So the second analysis is what happens when doctors do this. People will stop consulting the doctors as freely as they did. Doctor-patient privilege will be harming the whole industry to solve the curse through a wrong authority, right? So again, these individuals need to come up themselves, and for that, we believe doctors are not the right authority. What's the alternative today's government is proposing is that these doctors recognize that problem. These guys recognize that this individual is going through something. They can recommend a therapy. They can counsel them towards making the right decisions. But they're not the individuals who can make a decision.
Do you want me to pass the mic back so you can finish?
All right. So finally, the idea that even if doctors end up doing that, they won't be making a decision on their patient's behalf. And we believe that is the problem, that this voice needs to come from the patients. Now I'll pass the mic and thank you.
Okay, I want to try to address your arguments that you've come. So first, I want to go from the idea that the complaint or the accusation of domestic violence should come from the patients themselves. Now, you've already said that many patients, including many victims, don't understand that domestic violence is illegal and is a crime. I would say that if that is the case, that individuals don't recognize that a crime is being committed against them, this is not that they are committing a crime, but that a crime is being committed against them, then professionals like doctors who recognize that a crime is being perpetrated against somebody, even when the patient is unaware, or even when the patient doesn't want to move forward in the process of reporting the crime, it is their responsibility to that patient to report that crime. We can see a parallel in if a doctor recognizes the signs and makes a diagnosis of rape, even if the patient is unaware at the time that they were through drugs or or if they were drunk or whatever the case was, that they had to been raped, even if the doctor themselves recognizes that if the doctor themselves recognizes that the patient has been raped, even when the patient themselves does not, they have an obligation to report that, because rape is a crime. And rape is a crime that is going to be prosecuted by the state without necessarily needing to have the permission of the victim, which is the same as domestic violence. That moves me into my next point. You make the idea that you're minimizing a doctor's expertise. We're not saying that this is just some individual who's making a proclamation of domestic violence. In the case of the doctors, we're saying these individuals are professionals who are dealing with diagnosing, and they have diagnosed the signs and symptoms of domestic violence. So to call their diagnosis, their expertise, and their experience just a guess, I think, is disingenuous to the profession as a whole, and disrespectful to doctors and their abilities to help. Let's see. You're saying that doctors, your final point, if I understood it correctly, would be that doctors will be making the decisions for the patients, where the patient should be making decisions for themselves, and doctors should only provide recommendations. Now, this is a fair argument. There's a doctor can only make recommendations on treatments to type of if they're trying to treat certain illnesses. Doctors can say this is what we recommend, but when a doctor makes a diagnosis that this is what has happened, then that is not a treatment that he's doing. This is saying that this person has had X happen to them. X is illegal. They are under a legal responsibility to report a crime, just like.
Do you want me to pass it back? All right. So the first idea, that doctor's responsibility, I think what we're missing here. I'll clarify what I meant by the term guess. When an individual goes through like 8 years of school to perform a job, it's essential that he sticks to it. Why I called it a guess was that people consult doctors for them to diagnose their illness and cure them, not to report crimes. And if doctors end up doing that, we believe that'll be a social backlash. The main idea behind the Me Too campaign was that individuals come forward themselves and recognize that something's happened with them, something gross has happened with them in their past, and that has damaged their personality intrinsically. And when they come forward themselves, we believe that essentially solves the problem, that the victim is not silent anymore, right? And the second idea was doctors in this case are obligated to report those crimes. And when they're obligated, that every patient that walks through that door is essentially being diagnosed on two parameters: whether how is he getting to cure his illness, and how he got that, or how the physical damage. And the second parameter he's being diagnosed on is whether a crime was committed against him. So doctors are not keeping that privilege again. Then if this is the case here, then why not we break the lawyer and client privilege as well, or the information that accountants hold? Like, why don't those people report crimes too? So lawyers or doctors are not allowed to report anything, because unless someone is getting harmed, essentially like on a state level, of course. But thirdly, again, there's an obligation towards it. So when there's an obligation that you're harming the whole industry, how are you doing that? Now, when every doctor has to know that they're obligated to report a crime, they're gonna diagnose their patients differently. First, and second, they'll have a repute based on how many cases they've reported. And what if they make a wrong call? What if the patient's consent wasn't there? Patient wanted to recover and focus on his family, some other help. So the problem at the end of the day, what I essentially want you to answer is, A, how are you solving domestic violence at the end of the day? And B, how are you not harming the industry of these expertise? And thirdly, the idea that doctors do not essentially have to be neurosurgeons or walk-in clinics. They can also be therapists that help individuals make make a difference in their life. Sorry about that. Make a difference in their life through their mental capacity. Essentially, your psychotherapists or people who cure mental illness. Now I'll pass the mic.
Okay, I want to touch first on your idea that a patient comes to doctors in order to treat their illness and not to report crimes. This is true when the individual themselves is the one committing the crime. For instance, if the individual is doing drugs and they've overdosed, they want to come to a treatment center and they don't want to be judged by what they've done. They just want to be treated. I think this is fundamentally different than the idea of a individual coming to the doctor who has had a crime committed against them, who has been, in the case of domestic violence, been violently treated. Now, I think this is different. So you don't have an individual that is coming and saying, "Listen, I did this to myself. I don't want to go any further, but I just want some treatment." Basically, they're coming and saying, here I'm presenting, I have a broken arm, or I have a black eye, or I have some other damage, or I've been raped, and the doctor says, okay, well, I recognize that a crime has been happening to you. I'm going to report the crime, because they are the victim. The victim, the state is responsible, and because of the responsibility of the state, through the doctor is obligated to report when someone has been victimized. We see this. We see a parallel in this in child abuse. If a doctor suspects child abuse, or even if they have injuries that are could be potentially linked to child abuse, they are also required to report that. So we would not say that a doctor should not report child abuse if the child itself says, "I don't want to talk to anyone." Or if the parent says, "Listen, we're not going to talk about this. This is not going to happen," the doctor is still going to be obligated to report the child abuse, because the victim deserves protection. This is the same with lawyers, as far as I'm aware. If a lawyer has a client whose a crime has been committed against, if the lawyer finds out their client has been raped and they refuse and they don't pass that information on, then they're going to be liable. I don't know if it's negligence there, or if it's aiding and abetting. I don't know what their crime is, but they have to report when a crime has been perpetrated against their client. And then I'll come back in the next one and discuss on how this is going to help treat domestic violence. I'm going to pass the mic though.
All right. Just a short reply. So in a comparative analysis, my idea was, when the victim comes in, doctors should not be obligated, because the crime should be reported from the victim, because especially in cases of domestic abuse, it's essential that victims come forward themselves, because the nature of the crime is, most of the individuals don't recognize this to be a crime, since we've been fighting this war since the late 90s. Whereas your analysis comes and says that this time we don't have an oppressor sitting in front of the doctor, but the victim. We believe that even though if it is state's responsibility, you cannot use doctors or any other tools in the society to make decisions on behalf of these individuals, because it's something criminal at the same time and personal to their lives. So it's their decision to report it whenever they want to, not through a doctor. Why? And the way the state can fulfill the responsibility is that they can counsel them, they can recommend them a therapist, they can talk to them, they can counsel them towards making a decision. But this decision needs to come from a victim. We believe is how you solve a problem. There's a whole problem with making this decision and reporting this crime on behalf of the victim without his consent. That, we believe, is harming this whole idea. And secondly, I think we're again and again ignoring the fact that state is making this obligated for doctors, and I believe doctors will not be comfortable, not all of them, obviously, to make this decision or to call it a case of domestic violence and report it accordingly. So this is what my analysis has boiled down to. I'll pass the mic now.
Okay, just to touch briefly on the responses, you said a victim should come forward themselves. And in an ideal situation, a victim of domestic violence will have been assaulted, will come forward to the doctor, get treatment, will understand that a crime has happened to them, and will move forward to correct authorities so they can begin their investigation. That doesn't happen as often as we would like. So what happens is that a victim who in a domestic situation, they are limited and will be returning to their victimizer. And so they have limited options. They are, of course, going to be afraid. They're going to be hurt. They have just been hurt, so they have legitimate reason to be afraid. So to say that it is then the victim's responsibility to speak out against their oppressors, and if they don't, then we should not, the doctors who recognize the signs and symptoms of domestic violence should not speak out on their behalf, I think is just, I don't want to say that it is just disrespectful to the patients, but it seems to not care about their own safety. The doctors themselves want the patients to be treated, to be safe, to be in a safe environment. And if domestic violence can happen, I mean, their life is at stake. So if their life is at stake and the doctor doesn't choose to ask, they're again going to be willfully negligent. And you're saying here that the state can, to move on your second point about the state, the doctor is not saying that what happens is when is a act of domestic violence. They're not saying that domestic violence is what has happened. What they're saying is if you suspect something, you're obligated to let us know so that we can conduct a proper investigation, so that we can provide all those things that you talked about. The state does provide those. And so I think by obligating the doctors or counselors or whoever to say that if domestic violence is happening, to alert the state, that is letting them know where they need to most likely use that help. And I want to respond quickly in this last minute on the idea that how are they going to be solving domestic violence? I think the point of having the doctors a report of domestic violence is not that you can solve domestic violence as a whole. It is so that in the particular case of the victims that are coming in, the victims of domestic violence, you can save those victims who may not be in a position to save themselves, who may not be in a position to go out and contact the proper authorities. That obligation comes to saying, we recognize the signs and symptoms of domestic violence. They're obviously are not moving forward to get the help that they need. So I'm making a diagnosis here. I'm reporting it to the proper authorities so that they can do the proper investigation.
You want me to pass it back?
Just to finish up with that point, it's just that you're solving the domestic violence in that particular case. In that particular case, when an individual comes into the office, they've been injured, their life is again maybe at stake. You're solving it in that instance. The doctors are not seeking to solve domestic violence as a whole. They're seeking to protect their patients. They're seeking to make sure that their well-being is protected for the long term. This is what doctors do. It falls completely within their scope, and I see no reason why they should not be obligated to report domestic abuse. I'm gonna pass it back.
All right, so I'll just begin with a certain 4 different problems that I have with your actually 3, but there's one. Okay, so I'll start with there are institutions that there are already institutions in the society or in the setup that government has created to make you feel safe. When you go towards a doctor, you don't expect them to make you feel safe. You expect them to cure or make you feel better than you walked into their clinic. They go in there to get cured, and that's about it. And even in the 8 years of medical school, it is essentially taught them there are certain there are particular courses that tell you to be clinically detached from the patient as well. And why is that so? Because this links to one of the analyses I already told you. This is very personal. As criminal as it sounds that they've been victimized with domestic violence, it is very personal for them to make a proper to protect their personal aura and report that crime when the appropriate time comes. And it's solely their own decision to do so. And we believe that in particular cases of personal infliction, just like Me Too campaign, sexual harassment, domestic abuse, it is essential for victims to come forward, because the oppressor in this case thinks that these victims are not ever going to come forward because they are weak. And we believe when you report those crimes, you're not only entering their personal space, you're affecting them as an individual. Even if you cure one case, we believe it might harm them on some other levels. And at the end of the day, even if you end up solving one or two cases, we believe that it's not it will be ineffective, because in conservative societies like Middle Eastern, there will be masses of households that'll end up not sending their victims, because they have certain authority over these people. It's zoomed throughout our case. They might not end up sending their victims sending the victims towards doctors, right? And third, it's not the doctor's responsibility to make you feel safe. Thirdly, in you're not the point of domestic violence is that in every household there has to be a setup where everybody feels safe. And imagine solving this social problem through doctors. We believe it's not their job, and there are essential harms that I've explained throughout my case that'll ruin the whole structure of the society. There's law enforcement that has mottos that tell you that we're here to save you. There are advertisement campaigns that tell you like how you're going to tackle this problem, that how domestic violence is wrong. And why is that? Because they want the victim to feel safe, not through a doctor but through state.
You want it back? Okay. All right. So in my last 2.5 minutes here, let me just address those points you made quickly, and then I'll just sum up here. Basically, what I got from your last argument is that doctors are not meant to make people feel safe. They're meant to protect the health and treat individuals that come in for their care. And I agree with you. Doctors are meant to treat individuals and treat their ongoing problems. So you would not say, though, that a doctor should treat an individual for an overdose of some sort of drug and not treat them for addiction. And so basically it seems to me that if you recognize that doctors should treat somebody for a drug overdose, they should also then treat them for the situation that led to the drug overdose. So if that involves alerting the proper authorities, or if that involves putting on some sort of program, we recognize that doctors follow that treatment. Same thing with domestic violence. If a doctor treats the symptoms of domestic violence, then their responsibility is to go ahead and treat the source of the domestic violence. To treat the source of the domestic violence it's another individual. People don't domestically abuse themselves like they do inject themselves with their own drugs. So since the source of the domestic violence is another individual, the doctor is obligated to contact the proper authorities in order to deal with those individuals. And I think that's the idea, that doctors exist to heal, is the crux of this. If they're here to protect and to heal, it doesn't mean just in the moment. It means in their patients long term. And I feel that doctors, like I said in the beginning, doctors, with a very few exceptions, are the most likely to be in a situation to find those victims that are unable to, or unwilling to come out and speak about the crimes being committed against them, and to speak for them. Just like we have doctors, we give them the obligation to speak about child abuse when they recognize it, even if they're wrong, if they suspect it, to send it to the proper authorities to diagnose it and to check to see, do a welfare check. The same thing is going to apply to any sort of domestic violence. So doctors are here to protect their patients in the moment and in the long term, whatever that takes.
All right. Thank you for your points. So to summarize this debate has fell down on one essential argument, that whether it's doctor's responsibility or not, and what kind of role do they have to play in this case. Whereas my argument was that these doctors, even if they do have this responsibility in some certain way that you're trying to portray, it's not their decision to make, or it's not their decision to report the crime, because they can counsel they can counsel that individual to report that crime, but they cannot make the decision on their behalf, because of the importance I showed you why the victim needs to come forward itself. Secondly, the idea was domestic violence. The nature of the crime is that throughout the years we've been trying to make people aware that it's not an acceptable behavior, and these people need to accept it in a certain way. Thirdly, I argued that it harms the individual. It's a crime, but it's personal. and it's not the doctor's place to make that decision for that individual. Thirdly, it harms the whole industry because some doctors might not feel comfortable calling that on their patient's behalf, and it's obligated. And when you make something obligated, we believe